Weird offseason. Look, as we sit here right now, yes, the biggest offseason headlines for the Bengals, obviously getting everything taken care of when it comes to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. So Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, that's your core for the foreseeable future. And there's a lot of positives, obviously, that come with that. The negatives have come from the fact that this team had a lot of money to spend this offseason. They had a lot of holes that they needed to address and fix. And it's just been kind of a dud as far as the offseason goes, at least from a free agency standpoint. We still have to get to the draft coming up in the month of April, and we'll really get a better vibe of what the Bengals did to improve this team from last year heading into the 2025 season. But if you go outside of Cincinnati and outside of talking about the Jamar Chase, T. Higgins extensions, it just seems like this is just a horrible football team, that the defense is absolutely trash. The run game is trash. The offensive line is trash. Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins are really, really good, but they're not good enough to overcome trash defense, trash O-line, trash run game, trash this, trash that. Like, there's something there with this team, and I found it very interesting when ESPN Bet put out their win totals for next season, even before we get to the draft, which is where I think you fans have to really rely on them improving this team the most. I thought it was interesting to take a look at these win totals, and we'll pop them up now for those watching on YouTube. I thought it was very interesting that the Bengals win total is sitting right there in double digits at 10.5. A game and a half improvement. I mean, a game and a half, but yeah, a game and a half improvement, if you will, winning 9 games last year. How do you guys feel looking at the Bengals win total right there? Only 3 teams have a better win total than them, and it's the Chiefs, Ravens, and Bills at this point, according to ESPN Bet. Were you even surprised by the Bengals win total line being set at 10.5?
No, I'm not. I don't really know what else it would be, and I don't understand why so many people are shocked. This team went 9-8 last year. They retained a historic offense. The defense statistically can't be much worse, and we know how that Patriots game ended. We know how the Chiefs game in Week 2 ended. We know how both Baltimore games ended. We know how the Chargers game ended. I mean, there's 6 games in this Bengals schedule out of those 8 losses that you can easily turn into wins if that oblong ball just bounces a different direction. So I think if Evan McPherson is even a shadow of the kicker he was 2 years ago, this team is hitting 10.5, probably last year, and we're talking about a playoff team. So I don't think it's too much to imagine this team hitting 11 wins. I think last year it's very easy to find their way to 10, and then it's only a half-game improvement if you make a couple kicks or a flag stays in a ref's pocket or maybe comes out against the Ravens on a 2-point conversion. So I think 10.5 is right about where this team should be. We always circle back to when you have an elite quarterback, you're going to be in the mix. And I know the Bengals didn't make the playoffs last year, and everyone hangs their hat on no elite quarterbacks, missed the playoffs 2 years in a row. But the Bengals were in the mix at the end of the season. They ended the year on a 5-game win streak. To be right there watching Week 18, waiting to see how those scores shook out to see if they were going to the playoffs. And that was with one of the least lucky seasons in NFL history. So, yeah, I think 10.5 wins for a Joe Burrow-led Cincinnati Bengals is right about exactly where they should be.
It should be the expectation. We said it coming into, I don't know what show that was, a month ago, but we said that, our expectation this year for the Bengals is the postseason.
Yeah.
How to get into the postseason, you've got to win 10 games at least. And I think that the Bengals will win 11 games. I think the roster is going to be fine. The one-score thing or the close game, thing, eventually it falls for the Bengals. Eventually the luck goes your way. And I think that's what it comes down to. The Bengals lost every luck game that we could have last year, and whether or not you want to call it bad luck or just players not being good, that's fine.
Yeah.
My point being that I don't think the defense is going to be as bad as it was last year because it can't really be any worse. I guess if Trey does not play, if he sits out, maybe we'll have a different discussion. But if the Bengals have Trey Hendrickson playing in some capacity with a new defensive coordinator, I think the defense improves. Even if they improve slightly, they win 11 games last year. Just a little bit, they win 11 games. The offense, we know what that is. And the running game, I think, is fine. Chase Brown's really, really good. It just comes down to how good is that offensive line. And for what it was worth, last year wasn't great. It was at least serviceable. This year, I do have a couple questions, but again, as long as they're not the worst, the Bengals are going to be fine because we have the best when it comes to quarterback and wide receiver.
I see a lot of people in the chat pushing back on that 5-game win streak at the end of the year, and I'm sure Kenner was about to say it. The 5 wins came against 5 pretty bad teams. So why do you hang your hat on that one? Well, you play bad teams every year. And I think that's a level for the Bengals that we're at right now. Sure, we've lost those one-score games to all the competitors basically we played last year outside of the Eagles, but we beat the teams we were supposed to beat other than the New England Patriots. And that's a line of demarcation for teams in the league about where you're at. If the Bengals would have lost any of those 5 games, we're not watching that Broncos-Chiefs game in Week 8, wondering if we get into the playoffs. I think it means something pretty significant to beat, other than, again, in Week 1, which we blame on off-season practice and players being ready and contracts, holdouts, and everything along those lines. We took care of the teams that are considered worse than us. And that means a lot because plenty of teams in this league are looking back at the playoffs every single year saying, well, we lost, a bunch of these games that we shouldn't lose. And if you look at even a team like the Ravens last year, who I think if you ask any Baltimore Ravens fan about their season in 2024, they'd say it was a pretty good season, all things considered. They lost to the Raiders in Week 2. So those hiccups happen to everyone. And at the end of the season, it didn't happen for the Bengals when they needed those wins most. So I do think that means something from a culture perspective and moving forward into this year when you had to do something that most people viewed as impossible to keep yourself in the hunt, and then you do it. You still don't get into the playoffs, but I think that momentum does mean something going into next season.
In a separate conversation, I know we had this about like the defense. Like I do think overreacting to those 5 wins from the defensive perspective that we talked about weeks ago, there's a separate debate that I said that then. In regards to this, I don't think that this has any standing in that. The fact that they took those 5 wins and momentum into the offseason, and you're right, by the way, if the Bengals are a bad team, they lose one of those 5 or 2 or 3 of those 5. Yeah. Good teams are supposed to win those. They won them. They did what they were supposed to. In that regards, they tried to dig themselves out of a hole that they, obviously put themselves in early in the season, and even in the middle with a couple of those tough losses against the Chargers and obviously the Ravens, and especially in the second one when it comes to that. As far as Cincinnati goes, it's not that I'm surprised. Like this team, you're right. The expectation, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, like 10.5, a win total of 10.5. That's not that surprising. It should be that. I guess if you base it off vibes alone, if you base it off of not in Cincinnati, if you base it off how the team is talked about outside of Cincinnati, this team is going to be fighting for a wild card in 2025. I guess that's why, and I guess to be fair, to compete for a wild card, you still need 10 wins, obviously. Otherwise, the Bengals would have made the playoffs at 9 wins the last 2 years. So is what it is. I thought 10.5. I think it's the teams ahead of them as well that caught my attention as well. I mean, the teams that are ahead of them, no surprise. It's your Buffaloes, it's your Chiefs, it's Baltimore, teams like that. So that's fine. That doesn't surprise me, and I think Cincinnati's going to be just fine. I'm just curious to see what they do in the draft, which we'll talk plenty about as we get closer. I just thought it was a friendly line to give them considering the coverage of the team and considering they didn't add anything in the offseason, and we've yet to get to the draft. The thing is, I think that line total can go up a game or 2 if they nail the draft, whatever nailing the draft means as we sit here right now.
I do think something that's interesting to look at always when I look at team win totals is not necessarily what the number is next to the Bengals, but how it relates to the rest of the league, because that just kind of tells me where they view this team. Casey, if you could throw that back up there real quick. Yep. You see a few places below the Bengals, the Pittsburgh Steelers, which I think, as you're talking about, vibes outside of Cincinnati. If they're able to get this Aaron Rodgers deal across the finish line, I think most national media view them as a more legitimate contender, at least from a regular season perspective, than the Cincinnati Bengals with the current roster structure. And they have for the Bengals a full 2 games better than the Steelers with this current situation. Now, obviously, maybe a signing of Aaron Rodgers getting over the finish line bumps the Steelers by a win or so, but how many wins do you think an Aaron Rodgers signing would be worth for the Pittsburgh Steelers? Because I would say, even with that addition, the Bengals should be about 2 wins better than the Steelers. So I think 10.5 and slotted right in there as the 4th best contender in the AFC, I guess tied with the Chargers, also at 10.5. I think that's exactly where the Bengals belong, and I think the discrepancies, 1.5 between those top 2 and 2.5 between the back end of the wild card, I think that seems to make a lot of sense to me with how this shakes out. The one that really jumps off the page outside of the Bengals that's surprising to me is the New England Patriots, picking as high as they are in the draft with a rookie quarterback we only saw once with a win total of 7.5. That seems like a pretty significant jump. But the Bengals in relation to the rest of the AFC seem to make a lot of sense to me, even if you think that 10.5 number is really high.
There's a lot of teams on there that, again, based on, though the quarterback position weighs very, very heavy, there's a lot of teams on there that would rather be in the Bengals' current situation, even with the defensive faults, the offensive line struggles, with all the problems that you think the Bengals have. There's probably, 10 teams almost that probably would rather be in the Bengals' position than the position that they're in.
Oh, no doubt. Like every team below them. No doubt. And like
Yeah.
the draft, it's the draft, the draft, the draft. It's all going to come down to that. And so if the starting block is 10.5 wins for the win total before that, I think they'll be in good shape. Any other team on there? So you said the Patriots surprised you. Any other team surprised you where they fell on that list, good or bad? For me, I thought the fact that the Raiders were way at the bottom kind of surprised me. I'm not saying that they're making the playoffs or winning a Super Bowl, but they went out and got a legit quarterback in Geno Smith. You arguably have the best tight end in football at this point in Brock Bowers. Like, I'm a little surprised at how low they are on the Raiders, especially because the defense is what kept them in games last year. I love their defense. I like that they went out and got Geno Smith. Bowers is obviously key when it's all said and done. Are you guys surprised that the Raiders are as low in that list as what they are?
I'm not, because I'm not a Geno Smith guy. Everyone that tells me how much he's going to save the Raiders organization tells me how bad the offensive line was in Seattle. Well, he's going to a team picking in the top 5 of the draft. He has Jacoby Myers as his wide receiver 1 when he's been throwing to DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba for the last 3 years. I mean, I just don't see that team being competitive in an AFC that I think is an absolute gauntlet. I mean, you look at their division alone. The Broncos proved last year that they're at least a perennial playoff contender if they're not a playoff team. I have a ton of faith in the Harbaugh-led Los Angeles Chargers, and we know what the Chiefs are. So how many games in that division do you think the Raiders can win? And if we're looking at, an 0-6 or a 1-5, then I think it's pretty hard to get to that 6-win mark. I think this conference is really, really good this year, and I just don't think the addition of Geno Smith, and if they can't get, some real playmakers, which they haven't necessarily done so far, Brock Bowers is going to have to carry that offense, and I just don't think he can do much better than he did last year, and we see how many wins that equated to. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me, though I do think Pete Carroll will have that organization going in the right direction much sooner rather than later.
I think that the Raiders play in a gauntlet of a division. They play 6 tough division games. That's why I think they're that low. You know what I mean? They're not gonna be favored in any single division game they play. So for that reason alone, I would take them to have probably right around that win total. I am a little bit shocked that the Browns are I don't think the Browns have the worst roster. I could be wrong. I guess it all depends on who
Pickett.
it depends who they have at quarterback.
Right.
But if it's Kenny Pickett, then yeah, they're obviously.
If they take a Shedeur Sanders, that certainly gets them up above that last spot.
I would take them above. I think they're better than the Titans than whatever the Titans got going on. So
yeah, I was confused too, but I'm a homer. But I didn't get the Titans being ahead of the Browns. Like the Jets being ahead of them. The Jets have a good defense, but the Browns have a good defense. But the only one I had a problem with being ahead of the Browns was the Titans, and not just because they're picking ahead of them in the draft order, but when you think of the Titans, what are they? What are they? I don't think they have one position group that you could say, they're led by that group. The Browns at least have that defense, especially with Myles Garrett leading the way and fat and happy now and paid and taken care of. I just don't know what the Titans have. It is what it is. The Browns, though, 4.5. I can't really sit here and get that defensive.
Unless you're including the draft picks. Unless you're incorporating Cam Ward into that, then it doesn't make sense. But if you're including Cam Ward as their quarterback in terms of thinking of 5.5, I might say that's low.
Yeah.
So
maybe. Yeah.
I've learned I will never defend the Browns until they give me something to defend them on. So I'm going to.
They also play in the AFC South, and you play in the AFC North, which
is
probably a win or two right there.
Bingo. Just figured. See, you got to talk these problems out, and then we all come to a solution. I like it. Casey, how we feel? Your Bengals 10.5. The win total. The line. The win total out of the AFC.
Not to reiterate all the same points we've already mentioned, but I think that's right about where they should be. 10.5. There were 7 one-score games last year, and they were on the wrong side of those just about every single time. Yeah, I'll take my chances on them improving just a little bit and getting above that 10-win mark. So those are my quick thoughts.
How do we feel about I know this sounds silly, but the Chiefs, who just won back-to-back Super Bowls, got to a 3rd straight Super Bowl, obviously got blown out in that Super Bowl against the Eagles. But that offense, I don't care who the quarterback is, that offense is not that exciting. It's not that explosive. More off the field issues throughout the offseason with Xavier Worthy and some others. It's like, I don't know, man. If you really want to look at the Steelers and the Chiefs and say which one are you more confident is going to regress this upcoming season. I don't know who you would pick in that scenario. Pittsburgh has a tradition of always winning, and so does the Chiefs during the Patrick Mahomes era. But there's nothing about that offense that I find flattering, and it wasn't flattering last year, but I do feel like it regressed down the stretch as well. It got exposed in the Super Bowl against the Eagles. Luckily, they don't play the Eagles every single week. But are the Chiefs as good as what they're being propped up to be? I look at that win total, and I'm like, unless they add a legit playmaker, Tyreek Hill's trying to do his damnedest to get out of Miami, it seems. Maybe they find a way to land him. Unless they make a miracle addition to that offense, I don't buy into that Chiefs offense, as wild and ridiculous as that sounds.
They're going to add Rashee Rice.
Yeah, like I think that you can have that thought and that opinion, but that's just like my opinion on the Brewers, and all they do is win 100 games. So like the Chiefs won 15-2 with an offense that's going to get better in Rashee Rice this season. You know what I mean? They also lost Isaiah Pacheco for a large portion of that season. Kareem Hunt had to come in, and even when Pacheco came back, he wasn't healthy. So, the Chiefs' offense is what it is. The Chiefs are they're the team to beat still. They'll always be the team to beat until somebody finally beats them in the AFC.
My level of concern with Kansas City will be measured with exactly who makes it to pick 31 on draft night, because they are praying more than the Bengals and Bengals fans are for positions to work out. Because we've talked a lot about how the Bengals are going into this draft with their hands tied behind their back because they have to draft a guard and they have to draft pass rush help. Well, the Chiefs are in a very similar situation. Right now, their starting tackles are Jawan Taylor, who they did everything to get out of the lineup last year, and Jalen Moore, who didn't even start a game for them last year when they had a healthy lineup. So I am really, really worried about this Chiefs offensive line. The two times we've seen them look non-competitive in the Patrick Mahomes era, the Super Bowl against the Buccaneers and the Super Bowl against the Eagles, the reason why that took place was Patrick Mahomes was running for his life the entire time. Right after that Bucs Super Bowl, the Chiefs poured a ton of money into that offensive line to protect Patrick Mahomes, and obviously it resulted in multiple championships since then. Their solution this year, trade your all-pro guard Joe Thuney to the Bears. So I'm really worried about how this is going to shake out if they're unable to get lucky in the draft. But we've also learned over the last however many years, the Chiefs are just going to get lucky in the draft. And it's going to work out, and they're going to be fine. I think I feel better about their offensive lineup in terms of weapons going into this year than I did last year. And, I mean, that's with a healthy Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy with a whole year under his belt, Isaiah Pacheco without a broken leg. I have a hard time thinking the Chiefs are going to win less than 13 games until the Chiefs win less than 13 games.
Yep.